You have 30 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't destroy everything you've built with my money." The words hung in the boardroom air like a death sentence. Brett Harden's face went white as he stared at the woman he thought he knew, the woman he'd dismissed as nothing more than a trophy wife who organized charity galas and smiled prettily at corporate dinners. But Gwen Adams, not Gwen Harden as she'd corrected him moments before, stood at the head of the conference table wearing a power suit that cost more than most people's cars, holding documents that would end his career with a single signature. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of justice. Sometimes the person you humiliate in public turns out to own the very company that's about to sign your biggest deal. Sometimes karma doesn't just knock on your door. It kicks it down and burns your house to the ground. Her name was Gwen Adams, and this is the story of how she went from being the woman stripped naked for shame at a corporate gala to becoming the CEO who destroyed her husband's empire in less than 24 hours. How she discovered that the difference between being invisible and being powerful isn't money or connections. It's the moment you decide to stop hiding who you really are. But before we get to that beautiful moment of reckoning, before we see Brett Harden's world crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane, let me tell you something that will make this story even sweeter. Every success Brett ever claimed, every deal he ever closed, every moment of glory he basked in, all of it was built on Gwen's money, Gwen's connections, and Gwen's silent sacrifice. For 10 years, she'd been the invisible hand guiding his career, the secret architect of his success, all while he treated her like an expensive accessory. And if you think that's satisfying, wait until you hear what happened when his mistress decided to humiliate Gwen in front of 1,000 witnesses. Wait until you see what happens when a woman who owns a $15 billion empire finally decides she's done being quiet. This story will show you that sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't planned. It's simply the truth, delivered at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person. So settle in, because you're about to witness the most spectacular professional destruction you've ever heard. And trust me, you won't be able to stop listening until you hear every delicious detail. But let me start from the beginning, back when Gwen still believed that love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could shine brighter. Gwen had always been the type of person who believed in quiet strength. At 25, she'd inherited something most people could only dream of: controlling interest in Adams Industries, a manufacturing and investment conglomerate worth $15 billion. Her father, Theodore Adams, had built the empire from nothing, and on his deathbed, he'd made her promise something that would shape the next decade of her life. "True power is silent, sweetheart," he'd whispered, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength for a dying man. "Don't let them see what you have until you're ready to use it. Promise me you'll stay hidden until you're strong enough to lead, not just own." She'd promised, and she'd kept that promise even when it nearly destroyed her. For 10 years, Gwen lived a double life that would make a spy jealous. Publicly, she was Gwen Harden, the wealthy socialite who ran a well-funded but modest charitable foundation. She organized galas, wrote checks to worthy causes, and played the role of the perfect corporate wife. Privately, she was the majority shareholder of one of the most powerful companies in the country, making decisions that affected thousands of jobs and billions in revenue. The irony was delicious in the most painful way possible. While Brett strutted around corporate boardrooms taking credit for deals that Gwen had orchestrated through Adams Industries, she sat in charity meetings discussing fundraising strategies for amounts that represented pocket change compared to her real wealth. While he gave interviews about his business acumen and natural instincts for success, she signed documents that funneled contracts and opportunities directly to his firm. She'd met Brett at a business conference when she was 26, and he was a struggling consultant with big dreams and bigger debts. He was charming, ambitious, and completely unaware that the quiet woman in the elegant dress who seemed so interested in his ideas was actually evaluating whether he was worth investing in. Not romantically, that came later, but professionally. Brett had the charisma and the vision, but he lacked the connections and capital to make anything happen. Gwen had both in abundance, hidden behind her father's carefully constructed wall of privacy. It seemed like perfect synergy. She could help him succeed while maintaining her anonymity, and he could be the public face of achievements that her money and influence made possible. The first deal she arranged for him was worth $2 million, a contract between Adams Industries and his tiny consulting firm that should have been impossible for someone with his limited track record to secure. When he called her, breathless with excitement, she'd smiled and congratulated him on his brilliant presentation, never mentioning that she'd personally instructed the Adams Industries procurement team to give him the contract. "I knew I had something special," he'd told her over dinner that night, his eyes bright with success. "I could feel it in the room." They recognized real talent when they saw it. She'd nodded and raised her glass to toast his achievement, swallowing the words that would have revealed the truth. That was the first time she'd chosen his happiness over her honesty, but it wouldn't be the last. The pattern established itself quickly. Gwen would identify opportunities through her Adams Industries connections, then create situations where Brett's firm would be perfectly positioned to capitalize on them. She fed him inside information disguised as casual conversation, introduced him to key players at social events, and ensured that Hardened Solutions always had the resources and support needed to deliver exceptional results. Brett's confidence grew with each success, and so did his ego. What had started as grateful acknowledgement of her support gradually shifted to casual dismissal of her contributions. When she offered business insights, he'd pat her hand and tell her she was sweet, but didn't understand the complexities of corporate strategy. When she suggested networking opportunities, he'd explain that she moved in social circles, not business ones. The transformation was so gradual that Gwen barely noticed it happening until it was complete. Somewhere along the way, Brett had convinced himself that his success was entirely self-made, and he'd convinced her that her role was to look beautiful and stay out of the way. But the real betrayal wasn't his dismissal of her intelligence or his casual condescension. The real betrayal was Jasmine Brooks. Jasmine Brooks arrived at Hardened Solutions like a perfectly engineered weapon designed specifically to destroy everything Gwen had built. She was 32, Harvard MBA, with the kind of sharp intelligence that could cut through corporate politics like a blade through silk. More importantly, she had something Gwen had deliberately hidden for 10 years. The hunger to be seen as powerful. Brett hired her as marketing director without consulting Gwen, which should have been the first warning sign. He'd always discussed major decisions with her before, not because he valued her opinion, but because he'd grown accustomed to her quietly brilliant suggestions that somehow always led to his success. But Jasmine was different. She was the first hire he'd made that Gwen knew nothing about until she walked into their home office and found a stranger sitting at the conference table, reviewing confidential client files. "You must be the wife," Jasmine had said, not bothering to stand or extend her hand. Her smile was perfectly professional and completely cold. "Brett's told me so much about your charity work. How wonderful that you have something to keep you busy." The dismissal was surgical in its precision. In one sentence, Jasmine had established the hierarchy she intended to create. Brett at the top, herself as his professional equal and intellectual partner, and Gwen relegated to the role of decorative spouse with hobbies. What Gwen didn't realize was that Jasmine had done her homework. She'd researched every major client Hardened Solutions had ever landed, every deal they'd closed, every contract they'd secured. She'd noticed patterns that Brett himself was too arrogant to see. The way opportunities seemed to fall into his lap at exactly the right moments. The way certain doors opened for him that remained closed to competitors with better track records. The way his success rate was statistically impossible for someone with his actual qualifications. Jasmine suspected Brett had a silent partner or a benefactor, but she assumed it was family money or old boy network connections. She never imagined that the quiet woman who organized charity galas was the invisible hand guiding every major success in Brett's career. But she knew someone was pulling strings, and she was determined to figure out who and how to cut them out of the equation. The changes started small. Brett began staying late at the office more frequently, claiming he and Jasmine were working on strategic initiatives that required absolute focus. He started using phrases Gwen had never heard from him before, corporate buzzwords about synergistic partnerships and disruptive market positioning that sounded like they'd been lifted from business school textbooks. More troubling was the way he began to speak about Gwen's contributions to his success. Where he'd once acknowledged her support, even if he'd minimized it, now he seemed to forget it entirely. When she mentioned a networking contact she'd introduced him to, he'd correct her, explaining that he'd met them through his own professional channels. When she referenced a deal she'd helped him prepare for, he'd look confused, as if he couldn't remember her involvement at all. Jasmine was rewriting the history of Brett's success, and she was doing it so skillfully that Brett himself was beginning to believe the new version. In Jasmine's narrative, Brett was a self-made genius who'd built his empire through pure talent and determination. Gwen was a fortunate accessory who'd married well and now enjoyed the benefits of his hard work. The first real betrayal came during a client dinner that Gwen had arranged through her Adams Industries connections. The client was David Park, the head of international development for a major automotive manufacturer. Gwen had met him at a charity auction and spent weeks cultivating the relationship, learning about his company's expansion plans and identifying ways hardened solutions could provide value. She'd briefed Brett extensively on Park's priorities, his communication style, even his personal interests. She'd given him insider knowledge about the company's budget constraints and timeline pressures. She'd essentially handed him a roadmap to closing a $5 million contract. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration of Brett's successful presentation, but it turned into something else entirely. Jasmine had inserted herself into the evening, claiming she needed to discuss implementation details with Park. She spent the entire meal demonstrating her knowledge of the automotive industry, her understanding of international markets, and her vision for the project's execution. "Brett's lucky to have found someone with your expertise," Park had said to Jasmine as they waited for dessert. "It's rare to find a marketing director who understands both the technical and strategic aspects of a project this complex." Jasmine had smiled modestly. "I've always believed that success comes from understanding every angle of a deal. Brett and I make a good team because we both have that killer instinct you need in this business." The phrase hit Gwen like a physical blow. Killer instinct. It was exactly what Brett had told her she lacked, exactly the quality he'd said she'd never understand because she'd never had to fight for anything in her life. Now Jasmine was claiming to possess it, and Brett was nodding in agreement. "Gwen's more of the social side of things," Brett had added, his tone affectionate but dismissive. "She's brilliant at organizing events and managing relationships, but the hardcore business strategy, that's where Jasmine really shines." Gwen had sat there, watching her husband give credit for her work to another woman, listening to him diminish her contributions to party planning and relationship management. The client she'd cultivated, the deal she'd researched and strategized, the success she'd orchestrated, all of it was being attributed to Jasmine's killer instinct and Brett's leadership. That night, she'd found a credit card statement that Brett had left on his desk. Among the usual business expenses were charges that made her stomach turn. Expensive dinners at restaurants she'd never been to. Hotel rooms booked during times when Brett claimed to be working late at the office. Jewelry purchases from stores that specialized in gifts for younger women. The financial betrayal was almost secondary to the professional one. Brett wasn't just having an affair. He was building a new narrative of his success that completely erased Gwen's role while elevating Jasmine to the position of indispensable partner. He was rewriting their history to make Jasmine the architect of achievements that Gwen had actually created. But the most devastating realization came when Gwen discovered that Jasmine knew exactly what she was doing. During a company party at their home, Gwen had overheard Jasmine talking to one of Brett's junior associates in the kitchen. "The thing about men like Brett," Jasmine had said, her voice low and confident, "is that they need to believe they're self-made. They can't handle the idea that someone else might be responsible for their success, especially not a wife who doesn't understand the business world. So you give them a new story, one where they're the hero and you're the brilliant partner who helped them reach their full potential." "What about Gwen?" the associate had asked. "Doesn't she mind being pushed aside?" Jasmine's laugh had been sharp and dismissive. "Gwen's had everything handed to her since birth. She doesn't understand what it means to fight for something, to earn your place through merit instead of marriage. She'll step aside because that's what women like her do. They make room for women like me." The casual cruelty of it had taken Gwen's breath away. Jasmine wasn't just stealing her husband. She was stealing her identity, her contributions, her very place in the story of Brett's success. And she was doing it with the confidence of someone who believed she deserved it more than Gwen ever had. That was the moment Gwen realized that her father's advice about silent power had become a prison. by hiding her true capabilities, by allowing Brett to take credit for achievements that her money and connections had made possible. She'd created a situation where someone like Jasmine could waltz in and claim ownership of everything Gwen had built. The foundation of their marriage, their business partnership, their entire life together. All of it was built on a lie that Gwen had been telling for so long that even she had started to believe it. Brett genuinely thought he was a self-made success. Jasmine genuinely believed she was more qualified to be his partner. And Gwen had become so invisible in her own life that she was starting to disappear entirely. But she wasn't ready to act yet. Not until Jasmine made the mistake of thinking that Gwen's silence meant she was weak, that her invisibility meant she was powerless. Not until the night when Jasmine decided to humiliate her in front of 1,000 witnesses, never knowing that the woman she was destroying owned the very company that would make or break Brett's career. The setup was perfect, the trap was set, and Jasmine was about to learn the difference between taking someone's place and earning it. The Adams Industries International Expansion Gala was supposed to be the crown jewel of Brett's career. $400 million in contracts were on the table, representing partnerships with manufacturing facilities across 3 continents. It was the kind of deal that would transform Hardin Solutions from a successful consulting firm into a major player in the global market. What Brett didn't know was that Gwen had been orchestrating this opportunity for 18 months. She'd identified the expansion initiative during a routine Adams Industries board meeting, recognizing immediately that it was exactly the kind of project that would showcase Brett's strengths while positioning him for the international recognition he'd always craved. She'd spent months working behind the scenes, ensuring that the project specifications aligned perfectly with Hardin Solutions' capabilities, that the timeline accommodated Brett's existing commitments, and that the selection criteria favored his firm's unique approach. The gala itself was Gwen's creation, though she'd allowed the Adams Industries events team to take public credit for the planning. She'd chosen the venue, the Grand Ballroom at the Metropolitan Hotel, because its layout would allow for both intimate networking and impressive presentations. She'd curated the guest list to include exactly the right mix of international investors, industry leaders, and media representatives. She'd even selected the menu, knowing that Brett's potential partners had specific dietary preferences that would make them more comfortable and receptive to negotiations. Every detail had been designed to ensure Brett's success, just as she'd been doing for 10 years. The difference was that this time, she'd also been planning her own emergence from the shadows. 3 weeks before the gala, Brett had made a decision that shattered the last of Gwen's illusions about their marriage. "I think it would be better if you didn't attend the gala," he'd said over breakfast, not even looking up from his phone as he scrolled through emails. "This is going to be a serious business event, and I need to project the right image to these international clients." Gwen had set down her coffee cup carefully, her hands steady despite the shock. "What do you mean the right image? These are hardcore business people, Gwen. They're not interested in charity work or social events. They want to see that I'm focused, that I understand what matters in the corporate world. Having you there would send the wrong message." What message would that be? Brett had finally looked up, his expression patient but condescending. "That I'm the kind of man who brings his wife to business meetings. That I need emotional support to close deals. These people respect strength, independence, the killer instinct that separates real players from pretenders." There it was again, that phrase that had become Jasmine's signature, now coming out of Brett's mouth as if it were his own insight. Gwen realized that Jasmine hadn't just been rewriting the history of Brett's success. She'd been rewriting his understanding of what success required. "I've been to dozens of your business events," Gwen had said quietly. "I've never been anything but an asset to your career. That was different. Those were smaller deals, local clients who appreciated the social aspect. This is international business, Gwen. This is the big leagues. I need someone who understands power dynamics, who can speak the language of serious money." The implication was clear. Jasmine would be attending in Gwen's place. Jasmine, who understood power dynamics. Jasmine, who could speak the language of serious money. Jasmine, who had the killer instinct that Gwen apparently lacked. "I see," Gwen had said, her voice carefully neutral. "And you think Jasmine has these qualities that I don't?" Brett's smile had been almost pitying. "Jasmine grew up fighting for everything she has. She understands what it takes to survive in a competitive environment. You've been protected your whole life, sweetheart. You've never had to develop those instincts because you've never needed them. The irony was so profound it was almost funny. Brett was explaining to the majority owner of a $15 billion empire that she didn't understand serious money. He was telling the woman who had single-handedly created his entire career that she lacked business instincts. He was dismissing the person who had orchestrated the very deal he was about to present as someone who couldn't handle the big leagues. But Gwen had simply nodded and wished him luck, because she'd finally realized what her father had been trying to teach her about the difference between owning power and wielding it. The night of the gala, Gwen had dressed carefully in a midnight blue silk gown that cost more than most people's cars, but looked understated enough to avoid drawing attention. She'd arrived alone, using her Adams Industries board credentials to gain entry, and positioned herself in the back of the ballroom where she could observe without being noticed. Watching Brett work the room with Jasmine at his side was like seeing a master class in manipulation. Jasmine had transformed herself into the perfect corporate partner. Sharp, confident, and utterly focused on business. She spoke knowledgeably about international markets, manufacturing logistics, and regulatory compliance. She asked insightful questions about supply chain optimization and quality control standards. She was everything Brett had claimed Gwen could never be. The presentation itself was flawless, built on months of research that Gwen had conducted and strategies she'd developed. Brett spoke with the confidence of a man who believed completely in his own genius, while Jasmine provided technical details and market analysis that demonstrated their firm's comprehensive understanding of the project's complexities. Hardin Solutions has the vision and expertise to transform this expansion initiative into a competitive advantage, Brett had concluded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted his own success. We don't just deliver projects, we deliver transformation. The applause was enthusiastic, and Gwen could see the approval in the international investors' faces. The deal was as good as closed, just as she'd planned. Brett would get his $400 million contract. Jasmine would get credit for the strategic brilliance that had made it possible, and Gwen would remain invisible, her contributions erased from the story of their success. That was when Jasmine made her fatal mistake. As the formal presentation ended and the networking portion of the evening began, Gwen had moved closer to the main reception area, curious to hear how Brett and Jasmine would handle the follow-up conversations with potential partners. She'd positioned herself near the bar, close enough to observe but far enough away to remain unnoticed. She should have stayed invisible. She should have slipped out quietly and gone home to wait for Brett's triumphant return. She should have continued playing the role of the supportive wife who didn't understand the complexities of serious business. Instead, she'd made eye contact with Jasmine across the crowded room. The recognition in Jasmine's eyes was immediate and predatory. Here was the woman who'd been pushed aside, the wife who'd been deemed unworthy of attending her husband's most important business event. Here was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate, in front of 400 of the most influential people in international business, exactly who belonged in Brett's professional life and who didn't. Jasmine had excused herself from her conversation and walked directly toward Gwen, her smile bright and dangerous. "Gwen, what a surprise to see you here. I thought Brett said you weren't feeling well tonight." The lie was delivered with perfect innocence, but Gwen understood its purpose. Jasmine was establishing the narrative that Gwen's absence had been planned, that she'd been excluded for legitimate reasons rather than simply dismissed as irrelevant. "I'm feeling much better," Gwen had replied, matching Jasmine's smile with one of her own. "I wouldn't miss seeing Brett's presentation. It was quite impressive. Wasn't it? We've been working on this project for months. The research alone took weeks of 18-hour days, but that's what it takes to compete at this level. I'm sure you understand." Another perfectly crafted insult, suggesting that Gwen couldn't possibly understand the demands of serious work because she'd never experienced them herself. But Gwen had simply nodded, allowing Jasmine to believe she'd scored a point. That was when Jasmine decided to go for the kill. I was just telling the investors from the German consortium about the importance of having the right team for international projects. They were so impressed by our presentation, but they also mentioned how much they value working with firms that understand European business culture. It's all about projecting the right image, having people who can speak their language. Jasmine had moved closer as she spoke, her voice dropping to a more intimate level that suggested she was sharing confidential information. But her words were loud enough for nearby guests to overhear, and Gwen realized that an audience was gathering. "I'm sure they appreciate working with qualified professionals," Gwen had said carefully. "Exactly. That's why it's so important to have team members who've earned their place through merit rather than other circumstances. These international clients can spot authenticity immediately. They know the difference between someone who belongs in the boardroom and someone who's just playing dress-up." The insult was becoming more direct, but it was still wrapped in enough ambiguity that Jasmine could claim innocence if challenged. She was testing Gwen's limits, seeing how far she could push before getting a reaction. Gwen gave her exactly what she was looking for. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," she'd said, her voice carrying just enough confusion to suggest that Jasmine's implications were going over her head. It was the response of someone who was either genuinely naive or too intimidated to fight back. Either way, it was exactly what Jasmine needed to justify what happened next. The accident was perfectly choreographed. Jasmine had been holding a glass of red wine, and as she gestured to emphasize her point about authenticity and merit, she'd somehow managed to stumble slightly, sending the entire contents of her glass across the front of Gwen's silk gown. The stain was immediate and devastating, spreading across the delicate fabric like blood. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Jasmine did next, under the guise of trying to help. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she'd exclaimed, grabbing napkins from a nearby table and beginning to dab at the stain. But her movements were aggressive, pressing the wine deeper into the fabric, and her hands were positioned in a way that pulled at the dress's delicate construction. The sound of tearing silk was audible even over the ambient noise of the reception. Gwen felt the dress give way across her chest, the carefully constructed bodice separating along its seams. In seconds, she went from elegantly dressed to partially exposed, standing in front of 400 of the most powerful people in international business with wine-stained silk hanging in tatters around her. The silence that followed was deafening. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the room focused on the woman who'd been transformed from invisible observer to unwilling spectacle in the span of 30 seconds. But the real devastation came from Brett's reaction. Instead of rushing to help her, instead of offering his jacket or escorting her somewhere private, he'd simply stood there with an expression of embarrassed annoyance, as if Gwen's humiliation was somehow her own fault. "Jesus, Gwen," he'd muttered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Why didn't you just stay home like I asked?" That was the moment everything changed. Not because of the public humiliation, not because of the ruined dress, not even because of Jasmine's calculated cruelty. It changed because Gwen finally understood that Brett genuinely believed she deserved what had happened to her. He believed she was an embarrassment, a liability, someone who didn't belong in his world of serious business and international deals. He had no idea that his world only existed because she'd created it for him. Standing there in her ruined dress, surrounded by shocked whispers and barely concealed pity, Gwen made a decision that would destroy everything Brett and Jasmine thought they'd built together. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into the Adams Industries boardroom not as Gwen Harden, the dismissed wife who didn't understand serious business, but as Gwen Adams, majority shareholder and rightful CEO of the company that was about to sign Brett's $400 million deal. And then she would show them both what real power looked like when it finally decided to stop being silent. The drive home from the gala was the longest 20 minutes of Gwen's life. Brett sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone and occasionally shaking his head in what she assumed was continued embarrassment over her scene at the reception. He hadn't spoken to her since they'd left the hotel, hadn't asked if she was okay, hadn't even acknowledged that what happened to her was anything more than an inconvenient disruption to his evening. The German investor seemed impressed despite the distraction. He finally said as they pulled into their driveway. Jasmine handled the follow-up conversations perfectly. She managed to redirect their attention back to the project details. Distraction. That's what her public humiliation had become in Brett's mind. A minor inconvenience that his brilliant partner had skillfully managed. Not an assault on his wife's dignity, Not a moment that should have triggered his protective instincts, but a problem that Jasmine had solved with her superior social skills. "I'm glad she was there to help," Gwen said quietly, testing whether Brett would hear the edge in her voice. He didn't. "She really saved the evening. I don't know what would have happened if I'd been trying to handle damage control on my own. These international deals require a certain level of sophistication, and Jasmine just has that natural instinct for reading people and situations." There it was again, the implication that Gwen lacked the sophistication and instincts that came naturally to Jasmine. Brett had convinced himself that his mistress was not just his professional equal, but his superior, someone whose abilities exceeded even his own. The woman who had orchestrated his humiliation was being praised for her grace under pressure. That night, while Brett showered and prepared for bed as if nothing significant had happened, Gwen sat in her home office and made a series of phone calls that would change everything. The first call was to Harrison Webb, her father's longtime attorney and the only person outside the Adams Industries board who knew the full extent of her ownership stake. Harrison had been expecting her call for 10 years, waiting for the day when she would finally be ready to step out of the shadows and claim her rightful place. "It's time," she said simply when he answered. "Are you certain? Once you reveal yourself, there's no going back to anonymity." "I'm certain. I want an emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. And Harrison? I want every contract and agreement between Adams Industries and Harden Solutions pulled and reviewed. Every single one." The second call was to Margaret Foster, the Adams Industries chief financial officer, who had been quietly managing the preferential arrangements that had built Brett's career. Margaret had always questioned the wisdom of funneling so many opportunities to one consulting firm, especially one whose track record didn't justify the level of trust they'd been given. "I need a complete financial analysis of our relationship with Harden Solutions," Gwen told her. "Every contract, every payment, every resource we've provided. I want to know exactly how much of their success has been dependent on our support." "Should I prepare termination documents as well?" Margaret asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Prepare everything. I'll decide tomorrow what actions to take." The third call was to her personal stylist, because Gwen understood that tomorrow's confrontation would be as much about image as substance. She needed to look like the CEO she was about to become, not the dismissed wife she'd been pretending to be. "I need a complete transformation," she told Victoria Kane, who had been dressing powerful women for 20 years. "Corporate power suit, something that commands respect and projects authority. And Victoria, it needs to be perfect. This is the most important meeting of my life." As she made these calls, Gwen could hear Brett in the bedroom, talking quietly on his phone. She moved closer to the door and caught fragments of his conversation with Jasmine. "She completely embarrassed herself tonight. I know I should have insisted she stay home. No, she doesn't understand how these things work. You handled it perfectly, as always." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Brett was rehashing the evening's events with his mistress, discussing Gwen's humiliation as if it were a business problem they'd successfully managed. There was no concern for her feelings, no recognition that she'd been the victim of a deliberate attack, no acknowledgement that his own reaction had been inadequate. But what came next was even worse. "The contracts should be finalized by Friday," Brett continued. "Once this deal is signed, we'll have the financial security to make some changes. I've been thinking about what you said regarding long-term partnerships, both professional and personal." Gwen's blood went cold. They weren't just planning to continue their affair. They were planning a future together, one that apparently involved significant changes to Brett's current situation. Changes that would undoubtedly include divorcing the wife who had become an embarrassment and marrying the partner who understood serious business. The fourth call Gwen made was to her divorce attorney. The next morning, Brett left early for what he called pre-meeting strategy sessions with Jasmine. He was practically vibrating with excitement about the contract signing, convinced that today would mark his transformation from successful consultant to international business leader. "This is it, Gwen," he'd said over coffee, his enthusiasm genuine for the first time in months. "This deal is going to change everything for us. We'll finally have the kind of success that opens every door, the kind of reputation that commands real respect." The irony was staggering. Brett was celebrating his impending success with the woman whose money had made it possible, while planning to leave her for the woman who had publicly humiliated her. He was talking about earning respect while showing none for the person who had sacrificed her own recognition to build his career. "I'm happy for you," Gwen had said, and she meant it. She was happy that Brett was about to experience the most devastating professional failure of his life. She was happy that Jasmine was about to learn the difference between taking credit and earning it. She was happy that both of them were walking into a trap they'd spent months setting for themselves. After Brett left, Gwen spent 2 hours transforming herself from dismissed wife to corporate CEO. The power suit Victoria had selected was charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, tailored to perfection and designed to project authority without ostentation. The shoes were Italian leather with a heel high enough to add presence, but low enough for comfort during long meetings. The jewelry was minimal but expensive. Her father's watch, diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, and the Adams Industries signet ring she'd never worn in public. But the most important transformation was internal. For 10 years, Gwen had practiced making herself smaller, quieter, less threatening to Brett's ego. She'd perfected the art of invisible influence, of achieving her goals without claiming credit. Today, she would do the opposite. Today, she would take up all the space she deserved and claim every achievement she'd earned. The Adams Industries headquarters building was a 40-story monument to her father's vision, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of corporate power. Gwen had visited the building countless times over the years, but always as a board member attending routine meetings or a donor checking on charitable initiatives. Today, she walked through the lobby as its owner, and the difference was immediately apparent. Security guards who had nodded politely at her for years suddenly stood straighter, their recognition of her authority instinctive and immediate. Executives who had treated her as Theodore Adams' daughter now saw her as Theodore Adams' successor. The transformation was visible in their faces, their posture, their sudden eagerness to acknowledge her presence. The boardroom on the 40th floor was already filled when Gwen arrived. 12 of the most powerful business leaders in the country gathered around a table that had witnessed decisions affecting millions of jobs and billions in revenue. These were people who had known her since childhood, who had watched her grow up in the shadow of her father's empire, who had been waiting patiently for her to claim her inheritance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison Webb announced as Gwen took her seat at the head of the table, "I'd like to formally introduce Gwen Adams, majority shareholder and incoming CEO of Adams Industries." The applause was respectful but restrained, appropriate for a moment that everyone had known was inevitable, but no one had been certain would actually arrive. These board members had spent 10 years managing a company for an absent owner, making decisions they knew she could override, but hoping she would continue to trust their judgment. "Thank you all for your patience," Gwen said, her voice carrying the authority she'd been hiding for a decade. "I know my father's decision to keep my ownership private has created some unusual circumstances, but I believe the time has come for transparency and direct leadership." She paused, looking around the table at faces that reflected curiosity, respect, and anticipation. "In 30 minutes, representatives from Hardin Solutions will arrive to finalize a $400 million contract that they believe is guaranteed. I want to discuss our relationship with that firm before they get here, because I think it's time we reevaluated some of our business practices." The trap was set, the players were in position, and Brett had no idea that his moment of triumph was about to become his complete destruction. The Adams Industries boardroom had been transformed into a theater of corporate power, with 12 of the most influential business leaders in the country seated around a mahogany table that had witnessed decades of industry-shaping decisions. At the head of that table sat Gwen Adams, no longer hiding behind the facade of charitable socialite, finally occupying the position her father had built for her. Margaret Foster had spent the morning preparing a presentation that would have made forensic accountants weep with admiration. Spreadsheets, contract analyses, and financial projections covered the conference table like evidence in a corporate crime scene. The numbers told a story that was both devastating and undeniable. "Over the past 10 years, Margaret began, her voice crisp and professional, Adams Industries has provided Hardin Solutions with preferential treatment valued at approximately $67 million. This includes below-market contract rates, expedited payment schedules, exclusive bidding opportunities, and access to proprietary market research. She clicked to the next slide, revealing a graph that showed Hardin Solutions' revenue growth alongside their Adams Industries contracts. The correlation was so perfect it looked like a mathematical equation. Without our preferential arrangements, Hardin Solutions would have generated approximately 15% of their actual revenue. Their current valuation of $42 million is almost entirely dependent on their relationship with us. Board member Thomas Blackwell, a man who had built his own empire from nothing, shook his head in disbelief. I've seen companies with better track records struggle to get a single contract with us. How did Hardin Solutions manage to secure this level of preferential treatment? Gwen met his gaze steadily. Because I instructed you to give it to them. Every contract, every opportunity, every advantage they've received has been at my direct request. I've been building Brett Hardin's career for 10 years, and he has no idea. The silence that followed was profound. These were people who understood corporate strategy, who recognized the implications of what Gwen had just revealed. She hadn't just been supporting her husband's business. She'd been creating an entirely artificial success story, propping up a company that couldn't survive without her invisible intervention. And now, asked Patricia Vance, the head of international development, now we're going to see what Hardin Solutions is actually worth when they have to compete on merit instead of marriage. At exactly 10 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened to admit Brett Hardin and Jasmine Brooks, both radiating the confidence of people who believed they were about to close the deal of their careers. Brett wore his most expensive suit, the one Gwen had bought him for their anniversary, while Jasmine had chosen a power dress that projected competence and ambition. They entered the room expecting to find a routine contract signing with mid-level executives. Instead, they found themselves facing the entire Adams Industries board of directors, with Gwen Adams presiding over the meeting like a queen holding court. Brett's confusion was immediate and visible. Gwen, what are you doing here? I thought this was a business meeting. It is a business meeting, Gwen replied, her voice carrying an authority Brett had never heard before. Please take a seat. We have a great deal to discuss. Jasmine's instincts were sharper than Brett's. She recognized the power dynamics in the room immediately, understood that something fundamental had shifted since last night's gala. Her eyes moved from Gwen's corporate attire to her position at the head of the table, processing information with the speed of someone who had built her career on reading situations correctly. I'm sorry, Jasmine said carefully, but I think there might be some confusion. We're here to finalize the international expansion contract with Adams Industries. This appears to be a board meeting. You're absolutely right, Gwen said, smiling with the kind of warmth that made smart people nervous. This is a board meeting. Allow me to introduce myself properly. I'm Gwen Adams, majority shareholder and CEO of Adams Industries. The words hit Brett like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, then white again as the implications crashed over him in waves. The woman he'd dismissed as a trophy wife, the woman he'd excluded from his most important business meeting, the woman his mistress had humiliated in front of 400 witnesses. She owned the company that was about to make him rich. That's impossible, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I assure you it's not, Gwen replied, her tone remaining perfectly professional. I inherited controlling interest in Adams Industries from my father, Theodore Adams, 10 years ago. I've been managing my ownership stake privately while maintaining other interests. Jasmine's face had gone ashen as she processed the magnitude of her miscalculation. The woman she'd targeted for destruction wasn't just Brett's wife. She was one of the most powerful people in corporate America. The humiliation she'd orchestrated hadn't been delivered to a helpless socialite, but to the person who controlled their entire professional future. But you never said. Brett began, then stopped, his mind racing through 10 years of conversations, trying to understand how he'd missed something so enormous. You never asked, Gwen said simply. You were so convinced that your success was self-made, so certain that I couldn't possibly understand serious business, that it never occurred to you to wonder where your opportunities were actually coming from. She gestured to Margaret, who began distributing copies of the financial analysis to Brett and Jasmine. The numbers were devastating in their clarity, showing exactly how dependent Hardened Solutions had become on Adams Industries' preferential treatment. Every major contract you've ever won, every client relationship you've built, every success you've celebrated, all of it has been possible because I made it possible. I've been the invisible hand guiding your career, Brett, and you've been taking credit for my work for 10 years. Brett stared at the documents in front of him, his hands shaking as he tried to process the information. $67 million in preferential treatment. Revenue projections that showed his company's complete dependence on Adams Industries contracts. Financial models that proved Hardened Solutions would collapse without continued support. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why would you do this without telling me? Because I loved you, Gwen said, and for the first time since the meeting began, her professional facade cracked slightly. Because I wanted you to succeed, and I thought that supporting you quietly was the best way to help you achieve your dreams. I thought that if you knew the truth, it would diminish your sense of accomplishment. And now? Jasmine asked, her voice steady despite the obvious terror in her eyes. Gwen's smile returned, cold and final. Now I think it's time for Hardened Solutions to compete on its actual merits instead of my hidden advantages. Effective immediately, Adams Industries is terminating all preferential arrangements with your firm. Future contracts will be awarded through our standard competitive bidding process, with no special consideration for past relationships. The silence that followed was deafening. Brett and Jasmine sat frozen, staring at documents that detailed the complete destruction of everything they'd built together. Without Adams Industries' support, Hardened Solutions would lose 70% of its revenue within 6 months. The $400 million international expansion deal they'd come to sign would evaporate along with their reputation and their future. You can't do this, Brett said desperately. We have existing contracts, legal obligations, which will be honored according to their terms, Gwen replied. But no new agreements will be executed, and no contract renewals will be offered. Your relationship with Adams Industries ends today. Jasmine finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. This is about last night, isn't it? About what happened at the gala. Gwen turned to look at her directly, and Jasmine flinched under the weight of that gaze. Last night was certainly illuminating. It showed me exactly how you and Brett view my place in his life, and it helped me understand that my father was wrong about the value of silent power. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. She stood, and the entire board rose with her, a gesture of respect that made Brett's humiliation complete. The woman he'd treated as an accessory was being honored by some of the most powerful people in corporate America, while he sat at their table like a supplicant begging for mercy. The meeting is adjourned, Gwen announced. Brett, Jasmine, you're welcome to see yourselves out. Security will escort you if necessary. As they stumbled toward the door, Brett turned back one last time, his face a mask of desperation and disbelief. Gwen, please. We can work this out. I made mistakes, but we can fix this. You're right, she said, her voice carrying a finality that made his blood run cold. You did make mistakes. You forgot that the woman you married was also the woman who made your career possible. And now you're going to learn what your career is actually worth without her. The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Gwen alone with the board members who had just witnessed the most spectacular corporate execution in Adams Industries' history. She had finally stopped being silent, and the sound of her voice was going to echo through Brett's life for years to come. The elevator ride down 40 floors felt like a descent into hell. Brett stood pressed against the back wall, staring at his reflection in the polished steel doors while Jasmine remained silent beside him, both of them processing the magnitude of their destruction. The financial documents clutched in Brett's hands told a story that was impossible to deny. His entire career had been an elaborate fiction, and the woman who had created it had just torn it apart with surgical precision. When they reached the lobby, Jasmine finally spoke, her voice hollow with shock. Did you know? Any part of it? Brett shook his head, unable to form words. How could he explain that he'd been so convinced of his own genius that he'd never questioned why opportunities fell into his lap with such convenient timing? How could he admit that his ego had been so fragile that he'd needed to believe his success was entirely self-made? The ride back to the Hardened Solutions office was a nightmare of silence and growing panic. Brett's phone had started ringing before they'd even left the Adams Industries building. Clients who had somehow already heard about the terminated contracts, partners who were suddenly concerned about ongoing projects, investors who wanted immediate explanations for rumors that were spreading through the corporate community with viral speed. By the time they reached their office, the damage was already becoming visible. Rebecca Walsh, their head of operations, was waiting in the conference room with a stack of contract cancellations and an expression that mixed sympathy with professional concern. "We've lost the Morrison account," she said without preamble. "They're citing concerns about our ability to deliver without Adams Industries backing. The Patterson Group wants to renegotiate their terms, and the European consortium has put their expansion project on indefinite hold." Brett sank into his chair, watching 10 years of carefully constructed success crumble in real time. The phone calls kept coming, each one bringing news of another client jumping ship, another partnership dissolving, another opportunity evaporating. Word traveled fast in the corporate world, and the story of Hardened Solutions' artificial success was spreading like wildfire. "How bad is it?" Jasmine asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Rebecca consulted her notes, her professional demeanor barely concealing her own panic. "Without the Adams Industries contracts, we're looking at a 73% revenue loss over the next 6 months. Our operating costs exceed our projected income by approximately $2 million. We have enough cash reserves to maintain current operations for maybe 8 weeks." The numbers were even worse than the Adams Industries analysis had suggested. Hardened Solutions wasn't just dependent on Gwen's support. It was completely unsustainable without it. Brett had built a company that existed only in the artificial ecosystem his wife had created, and now that ecosystem was gone. But the financial devastation was only the beginning. By afternoon, the story had reached the business media. The headline in Corporate Weekly was particularly brutal. "The $67 million marriage, how one CEO's wife built his empire in secret." The article detailed the preferential treatment Hardened Solutions had received, the artificial nature of Brett's success, and the spectacular board meeting that had ended it all. The piece included quotes from anonymous Adams Industries sources who painted Brett as either a willing participant in an elaborate deception or a man so self-deluded that he'd convinced himself his manufactured success was genuine. Either interpretation was professionally devastating. Industry experts question whether Hardened Solutions ever possessed the capabilities they claimed, the article continued, or whether their impressive track record was simply the result of having access to insider information and guaranteed contracts through family connections. The phone calls from clients became phone calls from reporters. The questions grew more pointed, more invasive, more designed to expose the full extent of Brett's professional inadequacy. How long had he known about his wife's ownership stake? Had he deliberately concealed the conflict of interest from clients? Was Hardened Solutions capable of delivering results without preferential treatment? Brett found himself unable to answer any of these questions honestly without admitting that his entire career had been built on a foundation of lies and self-deception. But his attempts to deflect only made him look more guilty, more complicit in what the media was already calling one of the most elaborate cases of corporate nepotism in recent memory. The personal attacks came next. Social media exploded with commentary about Brett's relationship with Jasmine, speculation about his marriage to Gwen, and theories about how long he'd been taking advantage of his wife's hidden wealth. Photos from the previous night's gala surfaced, showing Jasmine's accidental destruction of Gwen's dress, and the narrative quickly shifted to portray Brett as a man who had betrayed the woman who made his success possible. Sources close to the Adams family confirm that Gwen Adams had been quietly supporting her husband's career for years, reported Business Today, only to discover that he was having an affair with an employee who publicly humiliated her at a corporate event. The story had everything the media loved: wealth, betrayal, corporate intrigue, and a spectacular fall from grace. Brett went from being celebrated as a rising star in international business to being portrayed as an ungrateful husband who had bitten the hand that fed him. Jasmine's situation was even worse. Her professional reputation, built on her association with Brett's success, crumbled overnight. The marketing strategies she'd claimed as her own were revealed to be based on insider information from Adams Industries. The client relationships she'd cultivated were exposed as connections that existed only because of Gwen's influence. Her killer instinct, the quality she'd claimed made her superior to Gwen, was revealed to be nothing more than the ability to take credit for someone else's work. "I need to distance myself from this," she told Brett during an emergency meeting in his office. "My career can't survive being associated with this scandal." The irony was devastating. The woman who had convinced Brett that Gwen was dead weight, who had argued that successful people needed to surround themselves with other successful people, was now abandoning him the moment his artificial success was exposed. "You can't leave now," Brett said desperately. "We built this together. We can rebuild it together." "We didn't build anything," Jasmine replied, her voice cold with the clarity that comes from seeing a situation without illusion. "Your wife built it, and we took credit for her work. Now that she's taken it back, there's nothing left to rebuild." She was gone by the end of the week, taking a position with a competitor who was happy to hire someone with her apparent expertise, as long as she could distance herself from the Hardened Solutions scandal. Brett watched her pack her office, removing every trace of her presence from the company they'd supposedly built together, and realized that her loyalty had been as artificial as his success. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Brett's own employees, the people who had benefited from the company's artificial prosperity, began to turn against him as the full scope of the deception became clear. They felt betrayed, manipulated, used as unwitting participants in an elaborate fraud. "We thought we were working for a legitimate company," said David Park, the senior consultant who had been with Hardened Solutions since its early days. "Now we find out that everything we accomplished was only possible because the boss's wife was pulling strings behind the scenes. How are we supposed to trust anything about this place?" The exodus began slowly, then accelerated as employees realized that their association with Hardened Solutions would damage their own professional reputations. Within 2 weeks, Brett had lost half his staff, including most of his senior leadership team. The office that had once buzzed with the energy of a successful consulting firm became a tomb of empty desks and disconnected phones. Brett found himself sitting alone in the conference room where he'd once held strategy meetings with Jasmine, staring at the wall where his awards and achievements had hung before he'd taken them down in shame. Everything he'd believed about himself, everything he'd built his identity around, had been revealed as an elaborate lie. He wasn't a brilliant businessman. He was a man whose wife had loved him enough to create the illusion of brilliance. He wasn't a self-made success. He was the beneficiary of the most generous and invisible support system imaginable. And he'd thrown it all away for a woman who had abandoned him the moment the truth came to light. The man who had once dismissed his wife as someone who didn't understand serious business was now learning what serious business actually looked like when you had to face it alone, without hidden advantages, without preferential treatment, without someone who loved you enough to sacrifice their own recognition for your success. Brett Harden was about to discover what he was actually worth in a world where merit mattered more than marriage, and the answer was going to destroy everything he had left. 3 months after the Adams Industries board meeting that destroyed his career, Brett Harden sat in a studio apartment that cost more per month than most people's salaries, but felt like a prison cell compared to the life he'd lost. The divorce papers lay on his kitchen table next to a stack of unpaid bills and a bottle of whiskey that had become his most reliable companion. Hardened Solutions had officially closed 2 weeks earlier, its assets liquidated to pay creditors and severance packages for the few employees who had stayed until the bitter end. Brett's personal finances, once bolstered by the artificial success of his company, had evaporated along with his professional reputation. The house he'd shared with Gwen was gone, sold to cover debts he'd never realized he was accumulating. The cars, the country club membership, the lifestyle that had seemed so natural and deserved. All of it had been built on foundations that crumbled the moment Gwen withdrew her support. But the financial devastation was nothing compared to the personal reckoning that consumed his days and haunted his nights. Brett had been forced to confront the truth about himself, and that truth was more devastating than bankruptcy or professional humiliation. He wasn't the brilliant businessman he'd believed himself to be. He wasn't the self-made success he'd claimed to be. He was a man who had been loved so completely that his wife had sacrificed her own recognition to build his dreams, and he'd been too arrogant to see it. The worst part was the growing realization of how Gwen must have felt during those 10 years of invisible support. Every time he dismissed her insights as naive, she'd been drawing on knowledge and experience that dwarfed his own. Every time he'd explained business concepts to her, as if she were a child, she'd been the person actually making the decisions that shaped his career. Every time he'd celebrated his own genius, she'd been watching the man she loved take credit for her work. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning when Brett was seriously considering whether he had the courage to end his own misery permanently. The voice on the other end belonged to Michael Torres, a man Brett had never heard of, but who claimed to represent a group of investors interested in second chances. "Mr. Harden, I know you're going through a difficult time, but I'd like to discuss an opportunity that might interest you. My partners and I believe that talented people sometimes find themselves in situations that don't reflect their true capabilities." Brett's first instinct was to hang up. He'd received dozens of calls from vultures looking to profit from his downfall. Reporters wanting exclusive interviews, competitors trying to poach his former clients, opportunists offering get-rich-quick schemes that would only deepen his humiliation. But something in Torres's voice made him listen. "We're not interested in your past mistakes or your personal drama," Torres continued. "We're interested in your actual skills, the abilities you developed before your situation became complicated by external factors. We think you might be exactly what we need for a project that requires someone who understands both success and failure." The meeting took place in a coffee shop downtown, far from the corporate towers where Brett had once felt at home. Torres turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had built and lost several companies over his career, each failure teaching him something valuable about resilience and authentic success. "The media narrative about your situation is interesting," Torres said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Everyone's focused on the preferential treatment you received, the artificial advantages, the spectacular fall from grace. But I'm more interested in what you actually did with those advantages while you had them." Brett shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure I understand. Your wife gave you opportunities, but she didn't do the work for you. She opened doors, but you had to walk through them. She provided resources, but you had to use them effectively. The question is, what did you actually learn during those 10 years, and can you apply those lessons without the safety net you didn't know you had?" It was the first time anyone had suggested that Brett might have developed genuine skills during his years of artificial success. Everyone else had focused on what he'd been given, not what he'd done with it. The possibility that he might have actual value, independent of Gwen's support, was both terrifying and hopeful. "What kind of project are you talking about?" Brett asked. Torres smiled. "We're launching a consulting firm that specializes in helping companies recover from major setbacks, bankruptcy, scandal, leadership failures, market crashes. We need someone who understands what it feels like to lose everything, who can speak authentically to clients who are facing their own moments of reckoning." The irony was perfect. Brett's greatest failure might become the foundation for his genuine success. His experience of losing everything could be exactly what qualified him to help others rebuild from nothing. "The catch," Torres continued, "is that this would be real work, with real accountability, competing against people who never had artificial advantages. You'd be starting over completely, proving yourself from scratch, with no safety net and no hidden support. Are you prepared for that kind of challenge?" Brett thought about the question for a long time. Was he prepared to compete on merit alone? Could he build something authentic from the ruins of his artificial success? Did he have the courage to find out who he really was when stripped of all the advantages he'd never known he possessed? The alternative was to continue his descent into self-pity and self-destruction, to let his story end with the spectacular failure that had already defined him in the public mind. He could spend the rest of his life as a cautionary tale, the man who had everything handed to him and threw it away for a woman who abandoned him the moment the truth came out. Or he could choose to discover whether there was anything real beneath the artificial success, whether the man Gwen had loved enough to sacrifice for had any actual substance worth salvaging. "I need to ask you something," Brett said finally. "Why would you take a chance on someone with my reputation? Why risk your own credibility on someone who's been exposed as a fraud?" Torres leaned back in his chair, studying Brett with eyes that had seen their share of human failure and redemption. Because I don't think you're a fraud. I think you're a man who got lost in a story that wasn't entirely true, and now you have the chance to write a new story that is. The question is whether you're brave enough to find out who you really are when you can't hide behind someone else's power. That night, Brett sat in his empty apartment and made the most important decision of his life. Not the decision to accept Torres's offer. That was easy compared to what came next. The real decision was to call Gwen and tell her the truth about everything he'd finally understood. The conversation lasted 3 hours and covered 10 years of misunderstandings, missed opportunities, and mutual pain. Brett apologized not just for the affair or the humiliation at the gala, but for the deeper betrayal of never seeing her clearly, never recognizing the magnitude of her sacrifice, never appreciating the woman who had loved him enough to make him successful at the cost of her own visibility. Gwen listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I'm glad you finally understand," she said eventually. "Not because I need your apology, but because I think you needed to give it. You can't build anything real until you acknowledge what was artificial. Can you ever forgive me?" Brett asked. "I already have," Gwen replied. "But forgiveness doesn't mean we can go back. It means we can both move forward without carrying the weight of what we did to each other." The divorce was finalized 2 weeks later, but the conversation had given Brett something more valuable than reconciliation. It had given him clarity about who he wanted to become. He accepted Torres's offer and threw himself into the work of helping other people rebuild from failure, discovering that his own experience of losing everything had taught him lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. For the first time in his life, Brett Harden was competing on his own merit, and he was about to find out whether that would be enough. 2 years after the spectacular collapse of Harden Solutions, the annual Corporate Recovery Summit had become the most prestigious event in crisis management consulting. The conference drew executives from companies that had survived scandals, bankruptcy, hostile takeovers, and market crashes. People who understood that sometimes the most valuable expertise comes from those who have experienced failure firsthand. Brett Harden stood backstage at the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel, the same venue where his artificial life had been destroyed and his real journey had begun. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to deliver the keynote address at an event hosted by Adrians Industries, speaking to an audience that included many of the same people who had witnessed his professional execution 2 years earlier. The transformation had been brutal and authentic. Working with Torres Recovery Consulting, Brett had spent 24 months learning what it meant to compete without advantages, to succeed without safety nets, to build something real from the ashes of something artificial. The work had been harder than anything he'd ever experienced, requiring him to develop skills he'd never needed when success was guaranteed. But the results spoke for themselves. Torres Recovery had become one of the most respected crisis management firms in the country, with Brett leading their corporate rehabilitation division. His client list included companies that had lost everything and needed someone who understood the psychology of rebuilding from zero. His success rate was impressive not because he had insider connections or preferential treatment, but because he genuinely understood what his clients were experiencing. The speech he was about to give had been 2 years in the making, a comprehensive analysis of authentic recovery that drew on his own experience of losing everything and discovering who he really was beneath the artificial success. But more importantly, it was his public acknowledgement of the truth he'd spent 10 years avoiding. As Brett walked onto the stage, he saw familiar faces in the audience. Former clients who had watched his downfall, competitors who had benefited from his collapse, and journalists who had covered his spectacular failure. But the face that mattered most was in the front row, where Gwen Adams sat with the poise and confidence of someone who had finally claimed her rightful place in the world. She looked magnificent. The past 2 years had transformed her from the invisible wife who hid her power to the visible CEO who wielded it with grace and authority. Adrians Industries had flourished under her direct leadership, expanding into new markets and establishing itself as a model for ethical corporate governance. She had become exactly what her father had hoped she would be, a leader who understood that true power comes from lifting others up rather than keeping them down. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brett began, his voice carrying the authority that comes from hard-earned wisdom rather than artificial confidence. 2 years ago, I stood in this same hotel as a man who believed his own mythology. I thought I was a brilliant businessman who had built a successful company through talent and determination. I was wrong about almost everything. The audience was completely silent, recognizing that they were about to witness something unprecedented, a public reckoning that went far beyond the usual corporate apology. The truth is that my success was entirely artificial, built on advantages I didn't know I had and support I never acknowledged. For 10 years, my wife used her position as majority owner of Adams Industries to create opportunities for my company, to provide resources and connections that made my success inevitable. And for 10 years, I took credit for achievements that were only possible because of her invisible sacrifice. Brett paused, looking directly at Gwen, who met his gaze with an expression of calm attention. I want to be very clear about what happened, because the media coverage of my situation has focused on the wrong questions. The question isn't whether I knew about my wife's ownership stake. I didn't. The question isn't whether I deliberately deceived clients about my capabilities. I genuinely believed I possessed the skills I claimed to have. The real question is how a man can be so blinded by his own ego that he fails to see the woman who is making his dreams possible. The confession was devastating in its honesty. Brett wasn't just admitting to professional failure. He was acknowledging a fundamental blindness that had cost him everything that mattered. Gwen Adams didn't just give me money or connections. She gave me something far more valuable. She believed in me enough to sacrifice her own recognition so that I could succeed. She spent 10 years making me look brilliant while remaining invisible herself. She endured my condescension about business matters while actually being the person making the business decisions. She watched me celebrate achievements that were only possible because of her work. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't the usual corporate rehabilitation speech about learning from mistakes and moving forward. This was a man publicly acknowledging that his greatest failure wasn't professional but personal. The failure to see and appreciate the person who had loved him most. The night my artificial success was exposed, I lost everything I thought I valued. My company, my reputation, my financial security, my relationship with the woman I thought was my partner. But I gained something more important. The opportunity to discover who I actually am when I can't hide behind someone else's power. Brett clicked to his first slide, showing the financial performance of Torres Recovery Consulting over the past 2 years. The numbers were impressive, but more importantly, they were authentic, earned through genuine skill and hard work rather than artificial advantages. This is what real success looks like. It's messier than artificial success, harder to achieve and impossible to fake. But it's also sustainable, because it's built on actual capabilities rather than hidden support systems. He clicked to the next slide, showing testimonials from clients who had worked with Torres Recovery to rebuild their companies after major failures. These companies didn't need someone who had always succeeded. They needed someone who understood what it felt like to lose everything and find the courage to start over. My failure became my qualification. My humiliation became my expertise. My artificial success became the foundation for authentic achievement. The presentation continued for 30 minutes, detailing the methodology Torres Recovery had developed for helping companies rebuild from crisis. But the real power of Brett's speech wasn't in the business strategies. It was in the unflinching honesty about his own journey from artificial success to authentic failure to genuine achievement. I want to close by addressing the person who made this transformation possible, Brett said, looking directly at Gwen again. Not because she supported me, she stopped doing that 2 years ago, and rightfully so. But because she showed me what real strength looks like when she finally decided to stop hiding her power. He clicked to his final slide, which showed a photo of Gwen at the podium during her first public appearance as Adams Industries CEO, addressing a conference on ethical business practices. This is what leadership looks like when it's authentic rather than artificial. Gwen Adams has built Adams Industries into a model for corporate responsibility, not by hiding her capabilities, but by using them openly and ethically. She has shown that true power doesn't come from taking credit for other people's work. It comes from creating opportunities for others to succeed on their own merit. The applause that followed was unlike anything Brett had ever experienced. It wasn't the polite acknowledgement of a successful presentation. It was recognition of a man who had found the courage to tell the complete truth about his own failure and transformation. As Brett left the stage, Gwen approached him with a smile that held no trace of the pain or anger that had defined their final years together. "That was beautifully done," she said simply. "It was overdue," Brett replied. "I should have said those things 2 years ago, but I wasn't ready to understand them yet." "Understanding takes time," Gwen said. "I'm glad you found your way to it." They stood together for a moment, two people who had loved each other imperfectly, but had both found their way to authentic success through very different paths. "I'm proud of what you've built," Gwen said finally. "Not because it validates anything about our past, but because it shows who you really are when you're not trying to be someone else." It was the greatest compliment Brett had ever received, because it came from the person who knew better than anyone the difference between his artificial achievements and his authentic ones. The man who had once dismissed his wife's understanding of serious business had finally learned what serious business actually meant. And he had discovered that the most serious business of all was becoming the person you were meant to be. 5 years after the night that changed everything, Gwen Adams stood in her corner office on the 40th floor of Adams Industries headquarters, looking out at a city that had witnessed her transformation from invisible wife to visible leader. The view was the same one her father had enjoyed during his decades of building the company, but the woman enjoying it now had earned her place through a journey he could never have imagined. The morning newspaper lay open on her desk, featuring a cover story about Adams Industries' latest initiative, a mentorship program for women entrepreneurs who had been marginalized or overlooked in their professional lives. The program, called Visible Impact, had already helped launch over 200 businesses, providing not just funding, but the kind of strategic support and recognition that Gwen had once given secretly to Brett. The difference was that these women knew exactly where their support was coming from, and they were encouraged to build authentic success rather than artificial achievements. The program had become a model for ethical business development, proving that true power multiplied when it was shared openly rather than wielded in shadows. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret Foster entered with the quarterly reports that showed Adams Industries continuing to thrive under Gwen's direct leadership. Revenue was up 18%, employee satisfaction had reached record highs, and the company's reputation for ethical practices had attracted top talent from competitors who still operated under old-school power dynamics. "The Torres Recovery Partnership proposal is ready for your review," Margaret said, placing a folder on Gwen's desk. "They're requesting a formal alliance to provide crisis management services for our client companies." Gwen smiled as she opened the folder. Brett's firm had grown into one of the most respected crisis management consultancies in the country, built on authentic expertise rather than hidden advantages. The proposal was professionally written and strategically sound, offering genuine value to Adams Industries clients who might face their own moments of reckoning. The irony was perfect. The man whose artificial success she had once supported in secret was now offering to support her clients through authentic expertise earned through his own failure and recovery. It was exactly the kind of circular justice that made her believe in the possibility of redemption. "Schedule a meeting with their team," Gwen said. "This looks like exactly the kind of partnership we should be pursuing." The afternoon brought a different kind of satisfaction. Gwen's assistant announced that Jasmine Brooks was in the lobby, requesting a meeting. It had been 5 years since the woman who had humiliated her at the gala had disappeared from the corporate world, and Gwen was curious about what had brought her back. Jasmine looked different, older, humbler, wearing the kind of understated professional attire that suggested she'd learned something about the difference between projecting power and actually possessing it. Her confidence was still evident, but it was tempered by something that looked like hard-earned wisdom. "Thank you for seeing me," Jasmine said as she took a seat across from Gwen's desk. "I know I have no right to ask for your time." "Everyone deserves a chance to speak their truth," Gwen replied, curious about what truth Jasmine had come to share. "I've spent the last 5 years learning what it means to build something real," Jasmine began, her voice carrying none of the sharp ambition that had once defined her. "After Hardened Solutions collapsed, I discovered that my reputation was built on association rather than achievement. No one wanted to hire someone whose expertise was revealed to be borrowed rather than earned." Gwen listened without interrupting, recognizing the familiar pattern of someone who had been forced to confront the difference between artificial and authentic success. I went back to school, got additional certifications, started over at an entry-level position with a small firm that specialized in helping nonprofits with their marketing strategies. It was humbling work, but it was real work. I had to prove myself based on actual results rather than impressive presentations. Jasmine paused, gathering courage for what came next. I'm here because I want to apologize, not just for what I did to you personally, but for what I represented. I was so focused on taking your place that I never stopped to consider whether I deserved it. I was so convinced that I was more qualified than you that I never bothered to learn what your actual qualifications were. The apology was more complete than Gwen had expected, acknowledging not just the specific harm, but the underlying arrogance that had made it possible. I also want you to know that I've built something I'm proud of, Jasmine continued. A consulting firm that helps women who have been pushed aside in corporate environments. We specialize in helping them rebuild their careers based on their actual skills rather than their ability to navigate office politics. Gwen raised an eyebrow. That sounds like meaningful work. It is. And it's work that I never could have done when I was focused on climbing over other people instead of lifting them up. My failure taught me something that my artificial success never could. That real achievement comes from creating value rather than claiming credit. The conversation continued for another hour, covering the lessons both women had learned about power, authenticity, and the difference between taking someone's place and earning your own. When Jasmine left, she carried with her a business card for the Visible Impact Program and an invitation to apply for partnership opportunities with Adams Industries. It wasn't forgiveness, some actions couldn't be undone, but it was recognition that people could change, that failure could teach lessons that success never could, and that redemption was possible for those willing to do the hard work of becoming better. That evening, Gwen attended the annual Visible Impact Gala, an event that celebrated the achievements of women who had built authentic success after being marginalized or overlooked. The ballroom was filled with entrepreneurs, executives, and innovators who had learned to value substance over style, achievement over appearance, authentic power over artificial advantage. The keynote speaker was Dr. Sarah Williams, a biotech researcher who had been pushed out of her previous company for refusing to falsify data, only to build her own firm that had developed breakthrough treatments for rare diseases. Her story was one of many that proved the same point, that sometimes losing everything artificial was the first step toward building something real. As Gwen listened to the speeches and watched the celebration of authentic achievement, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation at the gala 5 years ago had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. It had forced her to stop hiding her power and start using it openly, to stop supporting other people's dreams and start pursuing her own vision. The woman who had once believed that love meant making herself smaller had learned that true love, for others and for herself, meant claiming the space she deserved and using her power to create opportunities for others to do the same. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Brett, who was attending a crisis management conference in Chicago. Saw the Visible Impact coverage in the business news. Incredible work. You're changing the world by being exactly who you were meant to be. Gwen smiled as she typed her response. We both are. That's what authentic success looks like. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests departed, Gwen stood alone in the empty ballroom, remembering the night when her life had been torn apart in this same space. The woman who had been stripped of her dignity had become the woman who helped others claim theirs. The wife who had hidden her power had become the CEO who used it to transform an industry. The journey from invisible to visible, from artificial to authentic, from hidden to powerful, had been worth every moment of pain and every lesson learned. Gwen Adams had finally become exactly who her father had hoped she would be. Not just the owner of a company, but a leader who understood that true power was only meaningful when it was used to lift others up. And in a world that still too often rewarded artificial success over authentic achievement, that kind of leadership was exactly what the next generation needed to see. The story of the woman who owned the company was just beginning, and it was going to be magnificent.